Okay, ready when you are, Commissioner Hughes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Belle. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tyler Richards Hughes, and I'm the chair of the City of San Diego's Commission for Arts and Culture, Advocacy and Outreach Committee. We're going to do a quick roll call to confirm commissioner attendance. When I call your name, please unmute yourself and say present. Commissioner Dahan Blevins, Commissioner Michael Brown, Commissioner Vernon Frank.
Present.
Commissioner Gina Jackson.
Present.
Good morning, and thank you for your attendance. It has been noted. Also joining us today will be, when he's able to join us, Commission for Arts and Culture staff, including Executive Director Jonathan Gluss, and Chief of Civic Arts Strategies, Christine Jones, and Project Manager, Belle Reza. Before we get into today's agenda, I'm going to call on Belle to run down some of the guidelines for today's meeting. Belle?
Thank you. Hello, commissioners. Just a quick overview before we get started. Just please remember to keep your camera on at all times. Keep yourself muted. Unmute yourself when you're going to speak, and just go ahead and use your chat window to signal when you'd like to speak. Commissioner Hughes will call on you in the order received. We are conducting this meeting as a webinar. That is to provide greater accessibility to the public so they can provide comment in real time. The meeting for you will function exactly the same as a typical Zoom meeting. Commissioner Hughes?
Thanks very much. I also wanted to acknowledge the presence of the Commission's Chair, Ann Bossler. Thank you for joining us, Chair.
Thank you for having me this morning. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Wanted to just jump right in with the chair's report. This is our first meeting we've had in a long while, so just wanted to thank everyone for your attendance today. My goal really is that we check in with the advocacy team and get the team aiming towards direct advocacy with council offices. We want to bring in as many members of the full commission into advocacy as possible in those meetings as appropriate. The chair, Ann Bossler, and I will be in as many meetings as possible, and we want to bring in the rest of the commission as well. So just wanted to lay that out. That's my goal for advocacy for the first part of this year. That, and as always, my cultural plan, advocacy, wanting to bring that forth to all members of our elected officials. I know we've got some presentations and wanted to move on to those. I believe that Christine is going to go through the COVID-19 impact study on San Diego arts and culture organizations, and then we'll move on to the 2021 impact of city-funded arts and culture organization projects. So I'd like to invite Chief of Civic Strategies, Christine Jones, to present.
Thank you, Commissioner Hughes, and good morning, commissioners. It's nice to see Advocacy and Outreach Committee meeting once again. So as Commissioner Hughes indicated, I will be giving you all an update today on how some of our efforts in measuring the COVID-19's impact on San Diego's arts and culture nonprofits, and specifically sharing some of the results of a recent survey of city-funded arts and cultural organizations. So as you all know, one of the ways the city really cultivates a dynamic arts ecosystem is through supporting arts and cultural organizations. And these organizations have a vital role in San Diego with their economic footprint, their workforce, employment, and really the unique ability that they have to make meaningful impacts in communities across the city. So you might recall back in fiscal year 2020, the city invested $11.4 million to support arts and culture organizations and projects. And in fiscal year 2021, the city support was reduced to about $5.7 million, and that was due in large part to COVID-19 pandemic. And then most recently, in this fiscal year, so fiscal year 2022, the city did increase support for arts and culture organizations and projects from the previous year. So we're up to $7.7 million this year. So just wanted to give you a little bit of context before we get started with some of the survey results. So one other thing just to remember is that back in 2020, the city partnered with a nonprofit institute at the University of San Diego, to conduct the first survey of city-funded arts and cultural organizations. And that survey was conducted between July and August of 2020. And that was really done in an effort to start to better understand the impacts of COVID-19 on the arts and culture nonprofits. And the results of that survey were reported in a study that was released in fall of 2020 that was called Culture Shift, COVID-19 Impacts on San Diego Arts and Culture Nonprofits. So let's go to the next slide. So what we did in 2021 is we partnered again with the USD Nonprofit Institute to conduct a follow-up survey of the FY21 arts and cultural organizations that were being funded. So, and again, that was really to benchmark findings. It was also to see the continued impacts of COVID-19 on these specific organizations. So these organizations were required to complete the survey as part of their final report requirement that was due in this past summer in 2021. So this slide kind of shows a little bit of the breakdown of the organizations. There were a total of 124 organizations that responded to the survey. They're both small and large nonprofits, and there was really a variety of disciplines. 73% of the sample is made up of small and mid-size orgs, and approximately a third of the sample is small and mid-sized performing arts organizations. So overall, the respondents make up approximately 50% of the total registered arts and culture organizations in the city. So it does provide us a pretty robust snapshot of what's happening within this specific subsector. Let's go to the next slide. So you'll see this is the total reported financial loss for these organizations in fiscal year 2021 was a total of $77.4 million. So again, this is due in large part to the continued COVID-19 disruptions, the cancellations, the postponements, the closures. This number can be broken down further into earned and contributed revenue losses. So let's go to the next slide. So with regards to earned revenue, you'll see that the loss of earned revenue was about $63.2 million. This is particularly important for arts and cultural organizations that rely very heavily on earned revenue and particularly are vulnerable for many of them having a venue-based model. So this earned revenue loss does vary by organizational size and type. So for example, the performing arts and cultural organizations had the most significant losses in ticket sales and admissions, with 89% experiencing a decrease. And not surprising, larger organizations were more likely to experience a loss in space rental income than smaller organizations. Let's go to the next slide. So when compared to fiscal year 2020, there is some good news kind of in sense of fewer organizations reported a loss. So in 2020, you'll see on this slide, 95% of the respondents reported an earned revenue loss equaling $79.4 million. So compared to 68% of the respondents reporting a loss in 2021, and if that loss was less at 63.2 million. However, I would say that the 2021 data is still concerning for the stability of the organizations and the economy overall. Let's go to the next slide. So as far as contributed income in fiscal year 2021, the respondents reported a loss of a contributed revenue equaling about 14.6 million. Of particular note here is the percentage of small organizations that reported a decrease in individual donations, while only 27% of the larger organizations experienced the same. On a positive note, I would add that many organizations with budgets over $1 million reported an increase in board member contributions in 2021. So that's a positive. Let's go to the next slide. So this next slide shows the total reported loss of contributed revenue in comparison to 2020. So while the number of organizations reporting a loss and the total reported loss decreased, I think this shows that there's still clearly a significant impact to these organizations. So here on this graph, you'll see a comparison of the percentages of the organizations report source of loss contributed revenue in 2021-22. Notably, I think the biggest difference between the years was a shift in individual donations, with 38% of the organizations reporting a loss of individual donations in 2021 compared to 64% the year before. I think also notable here is the shift in foundation funding. So with 33% of the organizations reporting a loss in 2021 compared to 41% the year before. Let's go on to the next slide. So arts and culture organizations are huge nonprofit employers. As you know, they've been heavily impacted by COVID-19. This slide does show that as a result of the pandemic, that 689 employees were impacted by staff furloughs or layoffs in fiscal year 2021. The survey results show that the impact to these workers and the different employee impacts between artistic disciplines, with biggest impacts towards smaller organizations, as well as cultural and literary media art organizations. So it's interesting the size, again, and type is playing a role in some of these kind of differences. Let's go to the next slide. So as you well know, arts and culture nonprofits are very unique in the way that compared to other nonprofit sectors, because they do rely very heavily on freelancers, gig workers, and specifically artists, which often provide that artistic and cultural content for these organizations. So the survey results on this slide show that 86% of the respondents reported employing a total of 2,333 independent contractors in the 12 months prior to the survey. In the same period, these organizations reported canceling 130 contracts due to COVID-19. So with the hardest hit organizational type being performing arts. So I think the slide's very telling, or the information's telling in the sense of how interconnected these nonprofit organizations are with the independent workforce. Let's go on to the next slide. So this slide really does, there was I think a continued impact, obviously, in fiscal year 21 because of the mandatory health measures, the social distancing, and the closures. So at the time of the 2021 survey this past summer, 66% of the organizations still remain closed or partially closed. What the data illuminates, I think, here is that while the disruption of services continued in 2021, there was some positive shifts toward reopening, with 34% fully reopened when compared to only 10% the fiscal year before. So, however, I would say that many of the organizations shared that there's still a lot of uncertainty at the time we did the survey about the COVID-19 crisis, which made it hard for them to really start creating concrete plans, but did express their hope in moving forward in late 2021 and 2022. So let's go to the next slide. So many of the organizations in the survey expressed that transition to virtual in the early days of the pandemic, and have expressed more recently to more hybrid models. And it's really drastically changed some of their programming. For many of the organizations, it was an opportunity to take on kind of new strategies, adapt to challenges to serve their communities, even such as bridging the digital divide in some ways. And others were able to really expand who they connected to because of these new platforms. Some organizations also, and especially I would say performing and music organizations, expressed concerns though that virtual platforms made it harder to effectively perform their mission. About half of those organizations expressed that as they expanded into virtual settings, they did lose their regular audiences. This was accredited, I think, to some degree about virtual platform fatigue, supporters not wanting to see performances virtually, or heavy competition with organizations outside the region for those audiences. On the other hand, there were organizations that stated that they experienced an uptick in audiences participation from outside of San Diego, as well as internationally. So in total, 94% of the organizations reported that they plan to continue to use some type of online platforms over the next 12 months. Let's go to the next slide. So the data coming out of this survey related to regional response shows that these arts and culture organizations received emergency relief funding in 2021, majority continuing to come from those federal loans, especially that PPP, that Paycheck Protection Program. The data also shows there was an uptick in local relief funding in 2021 when you compare it to 2020. So I think it's important to note here that applicant numbers between the 2 years. So for example, there was a significant increase in funded applicants for the local small business and nonprofit loan program in 2021. So I think that was a positive in seeing those kind of shifts in relief funding. Let's go to the next slide. So as you might recall, in 2020, philanthropy was minimally responsive and engaged with the sample arts and culture organizations. At that time, 36% of the respondents reported receipt of nearly $3 million from local foundations and donors. That was for COVID-specific donations. In 2021, 41% of the respondents reported COVID-specific donations of 12 million. So you'll see this bar graph here really shows that dramatic increase between those 2 years of those COVID-specific donations. So that's a positive shift happening within that philanthropy. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide shows that the estimated costs and actual costs to reopen these organizations coming out of COVID-19. So the sum of the reopening costs reported by the sample was about 5.2 million, with another 20 organizations who were not yet reopened, but projecting about 1.5 million for a total of about 6.8 million in that estimated actual cost to recover. So what's interesting here is that the total cost projection of implementing recovery strategies for the sample organizations back in 2020, with so many unknowns happening at that time, was estimated to be nearly 64.6 million. So you'll see that that 2020 number was a real over projection of the costs to reopen. And I think that was probably just because there was so much uncertainty around relief funding and just in general about the pandemic at that time. So the good news is that the actual cost to reopen is considerably less than what was initially projected. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide you'll see here really shows some of the comparisons of organizational needs of arts and cultural organizations between the data of 2020 and 21. Not surprising, working capital is still at the top of the list. Also interesting, I think, to note here is some of the workforce related needs. So this includes an increase this year in the need for access to workers and employees when you really compare it to 2020. So bringing people back is kind of what that's saying to me, and also an increase in the need for support around managing the stress and anxiety of the staff. Certainly understandable, particularly for a lot of these organizations that had severe disruptions with their venues. Let's go on to the next slide. So I would say, though there was a high level of hope expressed, this was also paired with a clear need for these organizations to have multiple plans of action. A lot of them didn't feel 100% that they were in a post-COVID environment when they were surveyed back this summer. In their minds at that time, the pandemic was still very much in effect and their plans were really continuing to evolve. I think a particular note was that 59% of the organizations were concerned about potential future closures or reclosures at that time. Additionally, 43% of the orgs reported being very or extremely challenged about public safety, and 40% noted challenges with audience and customer retention. Let's go to the next slide. So this graph here shows the percentage of the organizations that predicting recovery efforts over the next 12 months. A particular note here, I think, is that 68% predicted bringing back, again, those independent contractors, and 61% predicted hiring new employees. There are also noticeable variations, I think, by organizational size here. So for example, 94% of the larger organizations projected hiring, while only 37% of the smaller orgs projected the same. And likewise, increases to wages or benefits are predicted by substantially more medium and larger organizations than small organizations. Let's go to the next slide. So a lot of some of the themes coming out of this most recent survey really had to do with some of the long-term structural changes that these organizations are experiencing due to the impact of COVID-19. So some of those themes kind of emerging included programmatic adaptations. Many of the respondents, although resuming in person, many of them expressed they will continue with some type of virtual access, creating possibly more permanent hybrid model structures in the future. With regards to workforce capacity and structure, many of the organizations expressed rethinking their staffing models, some with keeping less staff temporarily, restructuring their team setups, keeping flexible hours, or rethinking the usage or the necessity of space or either for programs or offices. The organizations, as far as their mission, their organizational goals, they continue to meet and adapt based on the changing needs of the communities that they serve, and especially in meeting the needs of systematically under-resourced and underrepresented communities. Most of the organizations did express that their missions will stay the same, but the pandemic only made their purpose stronger. And that they would continue to adapt as to how they fulfill that mission based on the evolving needs of their communities. And then one thing I think that's really key is that a lot of the organizations really understand the keys in terms of their financial stability are in the post-COVID, the post-government support, knowing that some of that government support that they've had over these last few years might, be like, for example, the PPP and other things might phase out. They are really looking at how they can diversify their incomes through, and particularly through new donor and support demographics. So I think that's a really positive that they're really looking for diverse financial commitments by different resources. So I think the results really do show that at the time of the survey, it's certainly still a challenging time for these organizations. And of course, the workforce they employ and contract with. I think it's important also to continue to note the changes, the adaptations and shifts that are occurring and continuing to occur within this particular ecosystem, and really can help us in our conversations about ways to better support and help to sustain this particular subsector. This is just kind of an abbreviated version of the survey results. The whole survey is in your packets. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that. I think it provides a lot of interesting context. So with all that context in mind and all that COVID information, I do want to shift now and give you some new information with regards to some social and economic impact numbers, and show you the kind of the third iteration of the city's arts and culture impact map. So let's go to the next slide. So as you all know, the city has been and continues to take a lean role in really sustaining and supporting the arts and culture ecosystem overall in San Diego, and that takes on a variety of programs and different initiatives. And we know that one of those primary ways the city does it is through funding of the local nonprofits. And of course, you all know that that supports performances, exhibits, parades, festivals, arts education. And that is really based on our two anchor funding programs or categories at this time, which is OSP, Organizational Support Program, and the project support, which is through Creative Communities San Diego. So over the years, as you all know, we've really collected that data from these organizations as part of final reporting. This really helps us for the city to understand its investment and to be able to show that it's really an economic driver. It's a financial multiplier that really helps generate jobs and drives tourism. So what you'll see here on this slide that shows the economic impact numbers for these organizations that were funded in fiscal year 2021, both organizations and projects. So as you can see, the financial implications of COVID-19 are pretty clear on the slide. The total expenditures and revenues, both the earned and contributed, substantially decreased in fiscal year 2021 when you look at last year and even prior years. So this was, maybe keep in mind, this was the first, fiscal year 2021 was the first funding year in which the entire funding activity period was during the pandemic. So I think that's really important to keep in mind too. And of course, it's not surprising that there would be so many disruptions to that would have financial implications due to the mandatory restrictions and closures that were happening that year. Also, I think it's important to note the workforce numbers that were related to total jobs funded and total salaries paid to employees and independent contractors noticeably declined in fiscal year 2021, which you can see here. So let's go to the next slide. So in addition to those economic numbers, we did want to capture a few numbers regarding kind of engagement. So you'll see here that the volunteers in fiscal year 2021 decreased by about 53%. Not surprising, given, again, many organizations had to kind of put a lot of their volunteer activities on hold because of the pandemic. The good thing is that while board members were up in fiscal year 2021, so I think that board members were rolling up their sleeves and really helping out in 2021. I think it's also important to note here that the number of people who benefited from free and paid admissions to the organizations was substantially higher in fiscal year 2021. One can infer this is in large part because of all of the online and hybrid offerings that were happening. And this is a number that's really all encompassing, and it includes all the programming and activities of the organizations, whether it was at their hubs and more in-reach or if it was outreach. So let's go to the next slide. So while this data collection from organizations is certainly helpful for us to better understand some of the investment from an economic and some of those social impact numbers, as you all know, it only tells part of the story. And that's where this map that we've been working on over the last few years comes in. So like last year, we worked this year with the city's IT department to create a new iteration of the impact map using kind of a GIS platform. And again, this is, we really took on this map project as a way for the city to better understand the impacts of this investment overall across the city, from the tourist focused areas to the more residential neighborhoods in every council district. So you might recall that this interactive map really becomes a visual storytelling tool where it really shows how these organizations are providing outreach, programming, and activities. And it really helps us also just see where those gaps or trends are happening, patterns over time, and how delivery of activities are happening. So, while it's easy in certain ways for the city to map organizational primary hubs, like a museum or a theater, which is, a brick and mortar, or a project site where perhaps a Creative Community San Diego project is happening, it only tells a fraction of the story. A lot of the story has to do with outreach. As you all know, arts and cultural organizations are relying more and more on outreach as a primary element of their work and their mission and impact within San Diego communities. So much of that programming, as you know, is focused on children, seniors, people with limited means of physical access. Many of the programs take place in neighborhoods or communities where residents have been traditionally less served, or organizations have traditionally not had as many opportunities, but the cultural vibrancy is extraordinary and it's there. Let's go to the next slide. So you might recall that the map identifies hub sites of the organizations. So these being, again, more of the brick and mortars, and identifies the museums, the theaters, cultural centers. The map also identifies and shows where the Creative Community San Diego projects actually took place. And many of those take place in multiple locations. And it also really shows the points of engagement and outreach that was happening beyond those hubs and beyond those project sites. And these were activities happening perhaps in parks or libraries or senior centers or schools. It might be with a social service agency or in the right of way or in a public gathering space. So the data itself, we collected the data as part of the final reports that they submitted back in the summer. And so the data, this means that for fiscal year 21, the data really is again reflecting that first year of a total funding activity year during COVID-19. So we're going to show that to you in some of the data coming out in just a few minutes. So let's go to the next slide. So again, you know, we really see this map and as really a tool over time. So you might recall that this is going to be again the third iteration of the map. So just a few highlights from last year's map. Last year was 3/4 were pre-COVID in terms of the funding activities and outreach happening. So that's, I think, really important to keep in mind. And then also, this also shows some of the highlights. So of the outreach. So last year, for example, there was 583 unique outreach locations. And this included schools, libraries, parks, recreation centers, as well as other venues. In addition to outreach, the Creative Community San Diego organizations carried out projects at 90 sites to activate those council districts with events like festivals and concerts. And then on top of that, there were about 101 OSP organizations that were providing programs and activities at their hubs. So there was a lot of pretty much robust activity happening last year. And again, you know, some of that was, that last quarter was really what was impacted by COVID. Let's go on to the next slide. So again, we're launching the third iteration of the map. And again, we're using data from fiscal year 2021. So it really does start to reveal some of the service level impacts of COVID-19 disruptions and closures that really were occurring during that fiscal year. It also really starts to reveal how these organizations responded to COVID-19 by embracing a lot of different strategies, including moving services to online platforms, creating new experiences and avenues of approaching arts and culture, and also collaborating in new ways and engaging in new ways with communities and neighborhoods. So the city-funded organizations in this map utilized virtual components in some ways or hybrid models to connect with audiences at specific venues and sites across the city. So you start to see that with this last map iteration. So let's go to the next slide. So what I'd like to do now is Kip is going to help today, and we're going to just briefly show you for a few minutes the landing page and the impact map for 2021. So, and I would just like to give a quick shout out to Kip. Kip has been instrumental in helping with preparing this map this year. So just a shout out to him for that. So you'll see here that this looks familiar as last year. This is the landing page. So as you recall, we really introduced the landing page last year. And this is a landing page that houses all the individual maps from year to year. So you'll see here, if Kip scrolls down a little bit, we'll start to see that the different maps, the individual maps, if you will, from year to year. So what's new is the 2021 map, which is here. And then you'll see the previous year, 2020. And then if you click on that little icon right there, you can go to 2019. So this will continue to house maps over time. If we could go back to the landing page for a minute. If we scroll down past this, you might remember that there is more of a comparative mapping tool. So we do a little bit of a comparative side-by-side that shows location of the orgs and the projects by category from year to year. So right here, these maps are a side-by-side kind of showing what happened in 2021 on the left in comparison to 2020. So as you know, the sites that are kind of identified can range from everything from schools to libraries, parks, rec centers. So if Kip is able to zoom in, we should be able to start to see some more specifics and comparative from year to year. So Kip, are you able to zoom in, for example, on, let's see, the elementary school, the Kumeyaay Elementary School? Is that possible? Oh, okay, there we go. So you can just see interesting comparisons for this school alone. You can see that on the left, they received art education by the organization Poway Center for Performing Arts in 2021, while in 2020, you'll see that the same school received outreach and different types of outreach from different arts and cultural organizations. So you can start to see some of the shifts even from 2020 outreach to 2021 in organizations and what's happening at these different sites. So before we move on, I do want to just highlight one thing, that when we compare 2021 to 2020, the MAP data illustrates overall a real decrease in outreach activities and programming. And it's by about 220 unique venues. So just, you know, that's just a big, I think, something for us all to be aware of, that there was a significant decrease in the number of venues between the two fiscal years. And there was a decrease also in the number of people engaged, that was by nearly 139,000 participants. So we really do see some dramatic differences between 2020 and 2021. And then this bar graph here, you'll see similar to last year, shows locations kind of for these programs and activities that are organized by council district. So then you can kind of start comparing the individual council districts from year to year, and whether it was a park or a library or an OSP hub, you can start getting a sense of what's happening. And I would say an interesting observation here certainly illustrates that between the two fiscal years, these organizations were still most actively providers of classroom-based arts education and arts, and I think arts and programming at other venues. Those are just the tops. Schools and other venues, and other venues can be senior centers, or they can be local businesses or public gathering spaces, but those were still the top outreach locations but in both fiscal years. While I would say that there's much more minimal arts activity happening this fiscal in 2021 in libraries and parks and rec centers. And I think a lot of that probably has to do with so many of the closures of libraries and rec centers because of the pandemic in fiscal year 2021. So if we could go now maybe to the map itself. So again, we clicked on that landing page and we clicked on the 2021 map. So now we're on the 2021 map. And again, this really starts to visualize the data from fiscal year 2021. Similar to previous years, we've included an introduction, their key highlights. This in 2021, despite a decrease, there were still 461,189 people participating in outreach programs. And they participated in these programs at 363 unique outreach venues. So while it was down 220 venues, there was still activity happening and a lot of activity happening. So I do think that's important to note that overall in 2021, there was 532 locations of activity that led to 884 points of connection citywide. And while that number is down from the year, it still shows a pretty vibrant outreach component for these organizations. And one thing also maybe just to remember is that these colored icons on the map distinguish organizations and venues. So when you go to explore these changes or explore just the 2021 data, you can select an icon using the search bar, or you can examine by council district. You'll see here that there's different ways you can explore. You can search, for example, in a search bar. You can put in things like a specific name of a site, like Valencia Park Malcolm X Library, and you can see what happened, what kind of outreach things were happening at that particular venue or site So here you'll see that I think there were 2 organizations serving that library last fiscal year. So there was Via Musica that did some work and Playwright Project. You can also start to see the number of participants served and the type of outreach they were doing at those locations. And then just to remind you, another way that you can visualize and kind of toggle with the data is through the different visual data layers. So here you'll see that there's, you can kind of turn on and off the different layers. There's also a heat map layer. You can look at it through borders of the council districts. So if we were just to look at parks, for example, you'll see there really weren't a lot of parks that were, there were a lot of parks that were impacted with COVID. So there are not as many parks this year, but the parks are still on here. And you'll see that, for example, a park up in Mira Mesa. And this park, you can see what organization was there working. And it was, I think, Aja. And they were doing some type of engagement event at the park. And they served 107 participants at that location for that particular program or outreach. So you can keep going. There's so many different permeations you can come up with when you start talking with the map. And then just to remind you, below the map here, there is a snapshot for each council district that kind of gives a little narrative and highlights some of the impact and the reach in that specific district in that fiscal year too. So, and then of course, the overall bar graph, similar to what was on the comparative landing page, is underneath here that you can drill down more into looking at that bar graph, which really organizes again by council district and also location. So I think that the new maps and data, as you know, we're going to be adding to this each fiscal year, and that it really is a tool for us to really start understanding how these organizations outreach within and across the city in different ways and different years and shifts that happen from year to year. I also think it's important for 2021 that the map also serves in some ways as a visual marker or a reminder that the recovery efforts for these organizations to return or reimagine or rebuild to pre-COVID levels in terms of their outreach and programs will take years. And so I think this is really impactful data for us to, and it's really information for everybody to utilize. And I think there's a lot of possibilities in using this data for San Diego's recovery and its future, and particularly for the subsector and how it relates to its communities across the city. So I know that was a lot of information. So happy to answer any questions. This link will be going live later today for the map. So we'll make sure that that is shared. It will be on our website. So you have basically the first sneak peek of the map for this 3rd iteration. And that concludes my report today.
Thank you, Christine. That is just amazing. And thank you to you and to Kip for all your hard work and the whole team for bringing that to the fore along with the city IT department. I love the map and I'm just a huge fan of all the data that we're able to analyze and share. Just a couple of questions for me, and then if any other commissioners had any questions. Is the map being sent directly to city council offices, or are we going to wait until we reach out with advocacy to pass it along?
Well, I think the intent is that you're going to be using it as part of your advocacy. And I don't know, Jonathan, please, it sounds like you're on the call, so please chime in if you want, but it's going to go live today.
Tyler, good morning, everybody. Yeah, we have a couple different options. Certainly we'll want to build this into the packet that we leave with every council member. It's possible that we will be taking it to the ED and IR, Economic Development and Intergovernmental Relations Committee of City Council, depending on availability on the schedule.
Cool, thank you. I have a whole slew of just data questions, including, are we doing, I know we're going to keep doing it going forward. Is there anything to be said for maybe doing a mid-year check just to see what Omicron did? And then is there any way of tracking specifically how increases in inflation, which is based in no small part on COVID's impact on supply chains, is hitting the sector as well? But I suspect, it's 10:51 and I don't want to dominate with just nerdy data questions that will appeal to me. So are there any commissioner questions that we would like to address now? Please write speak in the chat bar if you. I see Vernon type. Yes, Vernon, please unmute yourself.
Hi there. Yeah, two questions. One to Christine. Who are the users of this mapping website to date? And like, who are they and how many? How effective is it, the reach? And then and going forward, the target audience. That's my first question. And then I've got a second one. I'll wait for that one.
So what we've seen so far is that the map's being used by, first of all, the city. And when I say the city, I mean our office. So we're really using that and thoughtfully thinking that about what's happening. And so we can better understand the field and how we serve it and support it. Additionally, it's been used, I think, as an advocacy tool, particularly by you commissioners as part of your own ongoing advocacy. In addition, I think it's been serving an advocacy purpose for arts and cultural organizations and the projects specifically. They've really, there have been a lot of input expressed by them that they really are liking it. It's a helpful tool for them, not only for advocacy, but also to understand what their peers are doing, perhaps where nobody's serving. Looking, one could look at the map as an arts and cultural organization and see that this school hasn't gotten any type of outreach activity. And so I think it's being utilized in that way too. So I think there's a lot of different ways and different people looking at it for different reasons. So I think I think it has a lot of opportunity for growth in terms of who uses it and why. I would also say that it also kind of functions sometimes as a cultural mapping tool when you really kind of think about it that way, which could help inform, any type of future cultural planning process too. So it can be used for information and research in those types of planning processes too. So there's a lot of different ways that I think it has been used and can continue to be used. So I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. I appreciate the detailed response. So then just a follow-up to that, Tyler, then I would be interested to know, that's not going to be answerable right now, the expenditure, I'm interested in the return here, like how effective this is, and so the return on investment, like how much did we put into it, staff time, dollars wise, and such. But that's just a food for thought. Mm-hmm. My second question has to do with last meeting. So I'm looking at this at the presentation says COVID-19 impact on arts and culture. Many of us recall last commission meeting, a contractor expressed dismay at a delay in receiving funding. And so have we addressed that, and can someone update us on the distribution backlog?
Christine, I can take that. Well, firstly, Vernon, thank you for the question. We are updating excuse me, results on a weekly basis. Christine or Kip, do you have an update at hand from yesterday's 3 o'clock meeting?
Yes, I'm pulling that up now. So give me just a second. So what we have 135 organizations that have POs, meaning that they can start submitting invoices. We have about, and that's out of 171. So we have about 36 organizations that their contracts are still routing and being processed through the different departments. So we've really ramped that up in the last couple of weeks. So there are many more organizations that are able to invoice the city at this time.
Vernon, I would just add to that. I think we touched on this at the executive committee meeting. This is a result of staff shortages in purchasing departments, as well as arts and culture. It's also, that's the short-term issue that we're resolving now. It is also simply a result of really inefficient software. And one of the requests we put in this year for the FY23 budget is public grant making software that would be, I'll say this really succinctly, it would be extremely succinct because we wouldn't be manually moving the contracts from department to department. The portal would be open to various departments and we all could be working on it at one time. So we're hoping that that is actually going to be approved by City Council this year.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. And I just want to repeat, for me, it's heartbreaking I understand the problems and I get it. And it is what it is. But on the other hand, you know, we're talking about the impacts of COVID and we're sitting on money and people are waiting for it. You know, that's kind of a tough pill to swallow. So thanks for everyone for doing what you can to address that.
Excellent. Thank you for those questions, Vernon. And yes, thank you, Jonathan, Christine, and all of the purchasing team for pushing that forward as fast as you can. Vernon, just one thought off the top of my head on the impact or on the map. Personally, I would say that, you know, the audience is City Council and their staffs. There's a wider use, and you know, Christine's idea of using it as part of a cultural plan and using that data, that's like catnip for me. But it has right now a very targeted audience, and I'll tell you, having been in those meetings with City Council members and their staff, it has been very, very effective because they get to see in real time what their City Council looks like and what the heat map looks like. And it has been revelatory. So I'm a huge fan of this, and I think that I look forward to hearing what the data is in terms of costs, but I would recommend that it's well worth it.
I wasn't suggesting that. I just wanted to understand, and I didn't know that you've got firsthand experience with city staff and council people using this. That's remarkable. Oh yeah, I'll tell you, it was shocking actually to a few of them. They said, "Wow, I've never seen this. This is so cool. Holy moly, you're doing this much in our district?" Yes, the sector is. So it tells the story visually, like Christine said, and it's one of my favorite tools. I know that we're running short of time. Just to address really quickly, City Council outreach, it's in process. Belle is doing yeoman's work in scheduling that for members of the commission, and thank you very much for that. We will keep this committee and the larger commission up to date. In interest of time, I'm just going to push us along. Jonathan, do you have anything to report for Executive Director report?
The only thing that I'll quickly report, and this is a recap from Executive Committee, we've now, on the staff side, we've now made our presentations to the executive team. Christine and I presented our recommendations last week. So we being staff are now out of the discussion. So the next step on our end will be a full presentation to City Council. That is not scheduled yet, but it will be very likely late April. And so the ball is respectfully in your court at this point.
Thank you. And we take receipt of the ball, unlike the Bengals in the fourth quarter. All right. With nothing else pending, I'm going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you all for your hard work and your advocacy, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Perfect. Belle, are we done recording?